Hi, this is Teddy, and you're listening to Teddy Talks, a series within Two Broads Talking Politics. Today, our guest is Hana Bajramovic, author of Whose Right Is It? The Second Amendment and the Fight Over Guns, being interviewed today by me and my humble assistant, my mother. Hi, I'm Teddy, and this is Teddy Talks, a series within Two Broads Talking Politics. I am joined today by my assistant, my mother, Kelly. Hi.
Hi, Teddy.
And today we are speaking with Hana Bajramovic, author of the new book, Whose Right It Is? The Second Amendment and the Fight Over Guns, aimed at young readers 10 to 14. Hello, Hana, and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, can you tell us a little bit about your background and why you decided to write a book about the Second Amendment?
Sure. So I studied English in college, loved writing, and then I went to law school. And now I work. I've done a few things as a lawyer. I worked for a judge for a bit. I worked for a law firm for a bit. Now I work in reproductive rights. But my decision to write this book was actually based on a podcast. I don't know. Have you ever listened to More Perfect?
I have.
Yeah. So they have an episode on the Second Amendment. And I remember listening to it and being so amazed and surprised by the history of the amendment, and thought that I could meld, like the writing English background with the law school background to tell this story to a younger audience. And that was important to me, in part because tools and resources for a younger audience on the subject didn't exist yet.
And whenabouts was that you decided to do that?
Oh, wow. At this point, it's probably 2.5 years ago. It was around the time of Parkland.
Whenabouts? Really?
It's a word, Teddy.
Nobody uses that anymore.
And so Parkland happened in February of 2018?
Yes.
Okay.
So why did you focus on a young adult audience for this book? Do you think 10 to 14-year-olds should be reading about guns?
Yeah, I do. I think that, and I know there's questions for me, but I'd love to talk to you a bit about sort of your experience too in school. But, there are tons of school shooter drills in schools. A lot of kids have to carry clear backpacks to school or pass through metal detectors. Guns are a part of kids' lives, whether we like it or not. And so this book, I think, is a good way for young people to understand the problem better and maybe feel like they have more tools. But Teddy, I am curious, do you have school shooter drills? What is your experience like?
Nothing like that. Just, they tell us to be careful, but they don't really have any shooter drills, metal detectors, stuff like that.
You did have, I think, active shooter drills. So Teddy hasn't been in school since March.
Lockdown drills.
Oh, so you have
anything about a shooter.
You have had lockdown drills, but they didn't tell you why you would be on lockdown.
Yeah, I think I was in kindergarten. Mm-hmm. They would say that stuff in kindergarten.
Did that stuff make you feel scared, or how did you feel?
It's upsetting, but it's just the way things are. I've learned to accept that.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you feel like you, and I'm again sorry for asking questions when this is an interview with me. Do you feel like you know a lot about guns, or is it something that you want to learn more about?
Well, I really still don't understand. I'm really into physics, and I still don't understand how the mechanism of the more modern ones works. I'm just interested in the mechanism.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so I think Teddy has long been interested in guns themselves, but scared of gun violence at the same time. So that's, yeah.
Yeah, there's a section, there's like a page or two in the book where I talk about the history of the guns and the way the old mechanisms worked. The very old guns were very different from the guns we have today. They were very
You're comparing a matchlock to an AR-15.
Wow, great work. Yes.
That was his favorite page of the book, I think.
Oh.
More or less.
But while we're on this topic, Teddy, maybe you could talk too a little bit about, I think Teddy had a very strong reaction to the very beginning of the book where you're talking about the Parkland shooting and those kids. And then, once it got more into the history and stuff, I think it was less emotional. But Teddy, it seemed like you had a strong emotional reaction to that beginning. Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk some about that?
No, not really.
What emotions did it make you feel?
Just horrifying.
Yeah.
Yeah. The first person accounts of what it would like to have friends go through that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
We have an election coming up in 3 weeks. Do you think gun control will play an important part of that election, either at the presidential level or down ballot?
Yeah, I think it's important at all levels. I think, if you search Twitter for the term Second Amendment, you see like President Trump, endorsing people on the basis of their support for the Second Amendment. I think another big issue is the Supreme Court. And there's been a lot of talk about the nominee, Amy Coney Barrett's support of gun rights. And I think that's also crucial because, who fills that seat is relevant to the election, and that person's beliefs on guns are also relevant.
So, Teddy, I'm going to tell you this that you probably haven't heard yet. Amy Coney Barrett, who is the nominee for the Supreme Court, believes that formerly incarcerated felons should have the right to have guns, should not have the right to vote. What do you think about that?
Now, both of those are just wrong.
In what way?
Well, if they're a felon, most felons are convicted because of gun crimes. Am I right?
Actually, in that case, it's about nonviolent felonies. And I think that it's kind of a good point that people shouldn't lose their rights after they are incarcerated because, they did the time, but they continue to suffer afterwards. And so things like losing your voting rights in particular are wild. It's like an enormous disenfranchisement.
So my thoughts on this subject are, even if this still shouldn't happen, even if you allow them to have guns, you should monitor them. Not too much. Still give them privacy, but you gotta monitor everything they do, even if they do have guns. And I think they should still be able to vote. And like you said, it's wrong that they shouldn't suffer. They shouldn't still suffer once they've already served their time. But I think they still should be. They should still be monitored just in case it happens again, especially on murder charges.
All right. Well, we might need to have some criminal justice reform people on Teddy Talks to talk a little more about my views on that are a little more nuanced, Teddy, but we'll keep talking about it. But I think that maybe what we could tease apart here then a little bit in your talking about whose right is it and the history of the Second Amendment is this the wording of the Second Amendment itself and the importance of sort of the first clause, which is what a lot of more liberal people in the country might focus on, and the ending clause, which is obviously what the NRA has long focused on. Could you talk a little bit about that and from your legal background, sort of what that looks like?
Sure. So the Second Amendment reads, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms.
Their arms shall not be infringed.
Exactly. And, the first half gets erased a lot. Like, Teddy, did you know that first half existed?
Yes, in fact, I did.
Oh, okay. You might be the exception.
We have constitutions sitting around that they browse for fun. We may be unusual.
Okay, I will say that I, for years, did not know that first half existed, but I'm very impressed by you. But for most of the amendment's history, the militia was the focus. Like, it was viewed as a militia right. And that didn't start to change until the 1960s. And so I think what's interesting about that is that the shift in constitutional interpretation, like the way the court interpreted the amendment in District of Columbia v. Heller, was not the way that the amendment had been viewed for most of American history. And it all changed because of the NRA. And there's a big long chapter in the book about the tactics the NRA used in order to change constitutional interpretation. But that's what's so interesting, is that the case DC v. Heller was supposedly decided in an originalist way, but really it was a very new conception of the amendment.
And I'll just note to that, because I'm sure Teddy doesn't know as much about this, but gun control groups are now using somewhat similar tactics, running candidates down ballot, trying to get into states and state laws. So I think that it's been really interesting to watch how groups like Moms Demand Action in Everytown have learned a lot from what the NRA did and are now using the same sort of strategy to get things going a different direction.
Right, absolutely.
So in the book, it said that some restaurants allowed customers to bring loaded weapons into the buildings. What's your opinion on that sort of thing? That sort of stuff, bringing loaded weapons into public buildings?
I think that the balance of safety and gun interests is really off there. I think when we think about gun laws, a lot of what we're thinking about is balancing what are the public harms against the private right. And I think especially in places like restaurants that are crowded, where you have lots of people, that can be really dangerous. And there's a part of the book where I talk about, the argument that a lot of people make, which is that, guns can help prevent crime. So arming teachers or having good guys with guns stops bad guys with guns. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests that that might not actually be true, in part because, if you think about it logically, somebody who's using a gun for bad aims, they're the first person to shoot. They're the first person, they know what they're doing. And the defensive gun use, it's a lot of reaction time. So was it in Dayton, Ohio last year, where a man on a very crowded street, like a street of bars, began shooting. And in the few seconds before he was subdued, he already shot many people. I don't know the exact numbers, but I'm remembering this. And that made me think of, defensive gun use is hard. So it's hard to say that it could be used for good purposes.
I totally agree with you there.
Yeah. So also for context, we live in Chicago, where you do not see people walking around with guns. We have very strict gun laws, relatively speaking, in Chicago. Although, of course, and you talk some about this, the lack of national gun policy means that people can come over from Indiana, which is just a couple miles away, and drive across the border, buy guns there and bring them back over. But certainly within the city, we're not going to see people walking around Walmart with AR-15s or something like you'll see in other parts of the country.
Yeah, I'm from Chicago too.
Nice.
New York Attorney General Letitia James recently filed a lawsuit to dissolve the NRA because of fiscal mismanagement. What do you think that means for the future of the organization?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting lawsuit. It's really clever. It's something that it's rare, I think, to see the NRA on the defensive like that. She's arguing that the NRA abused its status as a nonprofit because executives misappropriated funds for their use. And she's seeking a bunch of different remedies, like, getting rid of some top leaders and even like dissolution of the whole organization. I think that if she's successful, probably it'll only be limited to some of those narrower remedies, like getting rid of the top leaders who she argues misappropriated funds. Because dissolution, you have to argue or have to prove that basically fraud was running rampant through the whole organization, which is a bit harder.
Just a side question here. Your last name, Bajramovic, where does that come from? What is your ancestry?
I'm glad you're curious. It's from Montenegro, former Yugoslavia.
So I have a question about, a lot of this in the book was somewhat familiar to me. I've been following gun control debates for a while. And even some of the history I knew, but hadn't sort of directly tied together all of the pieces about how they all went together in terms of gun rights and gun control. What really, really stood out for me was the way that race has intersected, especially in this country, how race has intersected with gun control legislation, with gun rights legislation. Was that something that you realized before setting out to write this? That was just sort of mind-blowing to me when I thought through it.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't realize it before writing it. It was definitely something that I learned as I was researching. I think two of the big takeaways I have from this book, one is that the story of guns is really the story of America. You can tell the whole country's history through guns. And two is that the story of guns is the story of race in America. And the book goes through tons of these examples, but, it starts at the very beginning where Black people and Indigenous people are forcibly disarmed. And then, in the pre-Civil War era, enslaved people would use guns to rebel. And so disarming enslaved people became, a goal of like white people who in both before the Civil War and even after. Like the KKK was founded as a disarmament organization. The KKK's aim was to disarm Black people who had guns. And I think that plays through, even through, the 60s, when the Black Panthers were some of the first people to adopt an individual rights reading of the Second Amendment, that second half of the amendment about the right of the people to keep and bear arms. The Black Panthers adopted that. And they said, that's why I have the right to police the police, which for people who haven't read the book is when the Black Panthers would, because of police brutality, they would observe arrests from a distance. They would stand and watch arrests in their neighborhoods with loaded weapons, which was legal at the time. And from that, the NRA, it's crazy. It's throughout the whole history of guns. Race is absolutely integral.
Yeah. What does KKK stand for?
Oh, thank you for asking. Ku Klux Klan. It is a terrorist organization that was founded after the Civil War to terrorize Black people.
Is there anything else you want to be sure we talk about?
I'm so happy you read it. I'm curious what your takeaway was. How did it make you feel? What do you feel like you learned from it?
It was very upsetting, but it's just the way things are.
Did you feel empowered, though, when you learned more about... So I had mentioned to Teddy that the real change in the conversation around guns in this country really came, a little over 2 years ago with the Parkland shooting, and that it was kids who are not that much older than Teddy, much closer in age to Teddy than to me, who really changed the entire tenor of this conversation. Do you think, Teddy, that your generation, you and your generation, are going to continue that cause? I mean, this is something that you have always seen as happening. School shootings didn't happen when I was a kid. That this is a fairly new thing in American history. Do you think that you will push back against it and work for different kinds of legislation?
I definitely will, as much as I can. And I would think that school shootings were happening a long time ago.
Yeah, not as long ago as you'd think, honey. When I was in high school is when the 94, the assault weapons ban. Yeah, in 94. So I was in high school then. So there was much stricter gun control legislation when I was in school, and it wasn't as much of a thing. Guns weren't as readily accessible, I think, back then. And it was just sort of it was certainly well before the Heller DC case. So, it was a different world, I think.
How can listeners get a copy of the book?
Well, thank you for asking. You can check out my website, hanabajramovic.com, HANABAJRAMOVIC.com, and all the links are there.
And we'll put those links on our website as well. Do you have any plans to write any more books? You're going to, I think we're all looking for a little bit of a vacation right now.
I do actually have plans. I'm going to, the next book in this series is about the 14th Amendment, which I'll be starting soon enough.
Do you know which one the 14th is? Looking for the Constitution. You can just ask her.
It's about equal protection under the law. So there's a whole bunch of cool stuff in that amendment, both about, race discrimination, gender discrimination, due process, all that stuff.
And we are, of course, hoping, Teddy has done a video about this a while ago, that the next amendment to the Constitution is the Equal Rights Amendment. So maybe you'll have another amendment to write about soon.
There's a good history there, too.
Well, thank you for being on this podcast, and I hope you have a good day.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Dimcast Podcast Network. Our theme song is called Are You Listening? Off of the album Elephant Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at Two Broads Talk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.